Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family.
All right, let's jump into the message this morning. So, one of the characteristics of our times and the age in which we live is choice overload. Have you noticed that? I mean, you go to the store and there's so many choices. I mean, so many choices on everything. When I was younger, the choices were not that large. Right? There were a few choices to pick from, and then you grabbed what you needed, you went. Nowadays, choices galore. It's hard. It's almost debilitating. You can't even make a choice. There's so many choices. Just for an example, you would think toothpaste. How difficult is it really? I mean, you got Colgate, you got Crest, you got Gleam, you got Pepsi. You got these lists of companies that provide toothpaste. But just among the Colgate toothpaste, you know that Colgate makes over 30 different kinds of toothpaste? Do we need over 30 kinds of toothpaste? I mean, there's total gum protection. There's renewal, whitening, restoration, sensitive, prevent and repair. I'm not sure what that does. Sensitive, lasting, fresh. There's baking soda, peroxide, whitening, bubbles, I guess. Renewal enamel, total SF whitening. I mean, the list goes on, 30 plus types of toothpaste to pick from just among Colgate, let alone the other brands. And this is like the way it is with everything. And of course, contemporary society tells us that the more choices we have for everything, the better off we are. But actually, studies show that the more choices we have, the more overload it brings and even can stop us from making a decision because there's too many choices. Has anybody ever done that? You go out to the restaurant, there's just too many choices. You're trying to find that right thing. There's so many choices. I'm not even sure what to buy anymore. And so sometimes it stops us from buying. It can even add to depression and anxiety because we have choice overload. And for life's decisions, we have so many decisions to make, so many options around us. Even for our biggest decisions, we can be on choice overload. Not sure what choice to make because there's too many choices out there that are available. So what do we do? How do we handle that? Well, one of the keys to living a satisfying and thriving life is discovering God's will for our life. And so this morning I want to talk to you about living for God's will. And there's this idea, I want to give you a few steps on how we move closer to God, and in moving closer to God, He can direct us in the path that He wants for us. But there's this idea that, you've heard the saying probably, it's easier to steer a moving ship than a stationary one. That seems to make sense, doesn't it? I mean, if it's not moving, it's hard to steer. Not sure who came up with that one. But it's often to illustrate a point that when our life is moving in a direction, it's easier to steer it in the direction we want it to go than just standing still or being paralyzed and not doing anything. And here's the thing, when our life is moving towards God, that is the best place for us to be, for Him to lead us, for Him to guide us, for Him to show us the will that He has for our life. And so let me give you a few steps that we can take out of this text that we're going to look at today on how we can be moving closer to God, kind of living for His will so that He can better lead us and guide us and direct us. I feel like when we're moving towards God, we're in the best place so that He can direct us in His plan and in His purpose. So let me give you a few of those this morning, maybe just a few more than a few. There's 5 this morning, but we'll keep it short. All right, number 1, arm yourself with Christ's attitude. We see that in verse 1 of 1 Peter chapter 4. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered in His body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. Whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. So he said, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. We need to take a stance. We need to arm ourselves with the same attitude. We need to arm ourselves with the same thoughts of Jesus. And specifically in this verse, he's relating it to suffering. When we're going through difficult times, do we think like Jesus? Do we have this, what we call a biblical worldview, a Christian worldview, that when we're going through hard times, when we're going through suffering, we have the attitude of Christ in us? Now, that's not easy to do, but it plays a big part on how we respond to problems. Because we always have events, and even these activating events that kind of want to set us off, difficult situations, suffering that we go through. And all these events that happen to us all get filtered through our belief system. And our belief system then is going to cause us to react in one way or another, either positively or negatively. It's going to cause us to act in a way we get better or we get bitter through it. And so this becomes very important. We have events that we go through. We have crises. We have situations. We have suffering we go through. Our belief system then interprets that and causes us to react in different ways. And if we have the attitude of Christ, if we have the thoughts of Christ, then we are going to respond like he would respond. We're not going to respond like we would normally respond or how we want to respond, how our flesh wants to respond. We will respond like Jesus. So this becomes important. And what was happening in Peter's day as he was writing this, that the followers of Jesus were suffering. They were going through some stuff, and they were called by outsiders, by non-Christians, they were called haters of humanity. They were considered politically disloyal. They were considered abnormal. They were thought to be cannibals because they took communion, right? They were eating like the blood and body of Jesus. So they were considered, and they were being slandered for the way they were living. And so these early Christians were rejected. They were going through some stuff, and Peter's relating the suffering that Jesus had to the suffering that they were going through for their faith. So let me ask you a question this morning. What does Jesus' suffering mean for me? What does it mean for you? Because he links them together in this verse. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, he says, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because whoever suffers, talking about them, whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. So he's linking the suffering that Jesus did to the suffering that they were going through. Because there's something we need to understand. We need to arm ourselves with Jesus' attitude. And what we learn from the suffering that Jesus went through is a couple things. Let me share a few of those this morning. Suffering does not mean that I've been abandoned. When we're going through difficult times, when things aren't going our way, when we are suffering for the sake of Jesus, we have not been abandoned. God does not minimize the evil and the suffering that's going on. We've not been abandoned. He's not forsaken us. In fact, what the cross shows us, what the suffering of Jesus shows us, is that Jesus enters into our suffering. He doesn't watch it from afar. He doesn't watch it from above. He doesn't watch it from beside you. He's entered into our suffering by putting himself up on the cross and taking on our sin. He enters into our suffering. He's not forsaken us. He's closer than a brother. He's going through it with us, and he understands exactly how we feel. We've not been abandoned. You've not been abandoned. And he's entered into it. A second thing that it shows us is the suffering of Jesus shows us that we have not failed. Now, some suffering is because we failed, because we made mistakes, but the suffering that these believers were going through for simply following Jesus, being rejected by non-Christians, did not mean that they had failed, but actually they're suffering because they were doing what was right. Sometimes the suffering that we go through is because of what we're doing is right. Jesus told a parable that persecution rises because of the word's sake, right? And so sometimes we are persecuted for doing good, not evil. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have failed. We should be encouraged by that. Some of the stuff we go through is because we're doing what is right. We must realize that suffering is not always a result of doing wrong in this world. Suffering does not mean an end to my story. Sometimes we get into a crisis, we get into a situation, we're suffering, and we feel like this is the end. But it's not the end. Our suffering is not the end of the story. The suffering of Jesus was not the end of his story. It led to something bigger. It led to something greater, and it allowed you and I to get in on the greatest gift of all time. And maybe the hardest thing out of this text to pull out of or understand is suffering does not mean an end, or does mean an end to sin. As he says this at the end here, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. This is kind of hard to understand, and theologians disagree on what it means here. Some think he's referring to Jesus, that Jesus died for our sins. Our sin came upon him, and he paid the price, and therefore he's done with sin. But I think more closely relates to us that we're done with sin. And not this idea that we never sin. John talked about, if anybody says he doesn't sin, he's lying. But done with sin, meaning that suffering does have a purifying effect. And if we lean into God during our difficult times, it will take us further away from sin and not closer to sin. So in that sense, I think we are done with sin. So suffering does mean an end to sin. It can bring us closer to God. So probably more referring to us. In verse 2, he says, as a result, he said, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for human or evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. He says, as a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for human desires. Now, here's the thing. In life, if we're going to arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ, we realize that situations are always going to present two options, that we can live it out in our flesh or we can follow God in the Spirit. Those two options are always available to us. The choice we need to constantly take is to be led by the Spirit, to follow God. Not to live out our life following earthly human desires, but actually following the will of God. When we arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ, we're setting ourselves up for following God's will. Now let me point one more thing about this evil human desires. This becomes very interesting. Obviously, it's clear, evil human desires, but this word desire in the Greek actually means over desire. It's not just desire, it's over desire. Now, for some of us, we're not maybe facing, evil human desires, but sometimes what it is we over desire something. Sometimes we want to be so successful that we over desire it and it becomes first place in our life. We can over-desire a good thing. There's lots of good things out there that we should desire, that we want, but we can over-desire it and it becomes evil in a sense. Almost too much of anything can be a bad thing. So we've got to be careful. Are we over-desiring? Maybe it's not the difference for you between good and evil, but what's good and what's best, or what's good and what's God. So the question becomes here, are we going to follow our own desires or over-desire? Because our culture loves to get into over-desire. It just breeds in us this desire for over-desiring. Think about shopping. Think about the way that, they market Christmas as we get into this holiday season. So many things we can't live without. I don't know how we've made it all these years without this one new gadget. We've got to have it. Over-desire. And our culture sells us on this all the time. What do we have a tendency to over-desire? Each of us have it. We have weaknesses in different areas. We have areas it's easy for us to not just desire it, but to over-desire. This is where we need to arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ so we don't over-desire even that which is good. Are we going to live a life in the flesh, or are we going to live a life in the Spirit? That becomes the question. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3 says this, all of us who've lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh, or the over-desire of our flesh. Our flesh has a tendency to over-desire things. We feel that. That's why we need to arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ. Doing the will of God. Let's go to number 2. Leave the past behind. We need to leave the past behind. Look what happened. This is I think, the big reason why Peter's writing this letter. He says, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do. You used to have this lifestyle of living in debauchery and lust and drunkenness and orgies and carousing and detestable idolatry. He goes, this is the way you used to live in the past. This is in the past. But they had left it behind, and there was a new way that they were living. They were following God. They were living by the Spirit. And notice that the people around them, were their family members, some of them were their friends, and the culture at large. They are surprised, in verse 4, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. This is why Peter's writing this letter. Because this is what they're going through. This is the persecution that they're going through. They used to join in all these wicked, evil things, and now that they're following Christ, they've given those up and they're doing God's way instead of the world's way, and the people around them are surprised, don't like it, and want to put them back in the box where they came from and say, you've got to live like us. And we sense that sometimes too, as trying to follow Jesus, the world wanting to put us into a box. You've got to do it this way. This is the way the culture does it. So let me ask you a question this morning. These people had a decisive break from the way they lived before to the way they're living now. Have you ever had that decisive break from your old way of life to a new way of life? As a follower of Jesus, not that we're perfect, but there should be a decisive break. There should be a difference, a moment in time. Maybe you can't put a date to it or a time to it, but you know that you were different on the other side of it than you are now. And if you're not, maybe you've not come to that point of crossing over into faith or surrendering your life where there's become a decisive break that I am different because I've surrendered my life to God, because Jesus has come into my heart, into my life, and now I'm different. Not that you're perfect, but you are different. I'll say it again. I think I said it last week, but you get a little kid that puts a couple of bobby pins into an outlet and they touch it. They're going to feel something. Their life is going to be changed because of it. You can't get in contact with an almighty God, but Jesus, who died on the cross for our sin, without having something different on the inside. And for these people, they had it. There was a decisive break. They were different, and the world didn't like it. And they were being persecuted for it. At some point, we've got to leave the past behind because we've surrendered our lives to Jesus, no matter who gets surprised by it. Verses 5 and 6, and Peter goes on to encourage them, because this is what he says is going to happen. He says, but they will have to give an account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. I mean, they're going to have to give an account for their persecution. He said, don't worry about them. He says, for this is the reason the gospel was preached, even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. He goes, don't worry, they're going to be judged for it. We don't need to try and get revenge or get even. We just forgive and keep moving forward in Jesus. Number 3, watch and pray. He talks here in verse 7, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. I love this. He says, be alert and of sober mind. Be alert. I mean, it's easy just to get lulled into a sleep and not pray, isn't it? To go day in and day out and just not really be alert and watchful, sober-minded, meaning serious about prayer. The world would love to lull us into that way. The devil would love to lull us into that way. Just think prayer doesn't work. It's not worth it. We're too busy. We don't have time for it. And he's saying, be alert and of sober mind. As Jesus said, watch and pray. Watching and praying, being alert, seriously praying. Do we do that? Do we shake ourselves up, become alert, sober-minded, pray? Watching and praying. Jesus told his disciples to watch and pray. What are we watching for? I think it's the idea of being alert. I think it's also watch and see, what is God doing? What can I see God doing, and pray along with that and encourage that forward motion. Watch and pray. Do we do that? Are we watching? Are we alert? Are we sober-minded? Are we praying? Or have we quit praying? Or we've just kind of slumbered in our praying? Like the disciples on the night that Jesus was betrayed just fell asleep instead of praying. Are we just kind of sleeping through our days, not really praying about what God wants to happen in this world or how he wants to use us or for those around us that are struggling? Are we praying? We need to keep on praying. We need to never give up praying. He says, Paul talked about never ceasing to pray, praying always. Are we praying? Do we keep praying for our children? Do we keep praying for our spouse? Do we keep praying for our parents? Do we keep praying for our coworkers? Do we keep praying for our church? Are we praying for our community? Or have we given up praying? Watch and pray. If we'll watch and pray, we'll continue in that motion towards God so that he can lead us and direct us in the path that he has for us. How about number 4? Love above all. He says in verse 8, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. He says, above all, love each other deeply. Do we love each other deeply, or do we love each other selfishly? How well do we do at loving? Does our love for others cover their sin? I mean, help them to become a better person, help move them out of sin? Or does our love for other people encourage them to sin? Does it make their life better, or does it make their life worse? Do we love above all? I don't know, when you come in contact with somebody who truly loves you, it just helps bring out the best in you. It helps encourage you towards God. Do we love above all else? That becomes the question. Let me add this in this morning. I found out this morning that Miranda Berry made a blanket for Miss Kay. Just out of, probably just being watchful, maybe prayerful, just think that's something nice I could do. And Mr. Chuck arrived here this morning with no blanket for Miss Kay. They did not put it in the car that they drove to church. And here she was sitting at the back with no blanket. And she had a blanket ready for her and gave it to him. And now she's sitting back there with a blanket. Are we watchful? Are we praying? Are we loving above all else? Are we just noticing people around us and how we could bless them or love them or care for them? Mr. Chuck said, that's a miracle. It's not something big and outside, but it's a little miracle of God just providing. Another miracle might be if we ever turned up the heat in this place. That would be another miracle. It's this idea of, don't start throwing stuff at me now. He says here, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Do we do that? Do we offer hospitality? Are we caring towards those around us? Again, do we love people deeply or do we love people selfishly? How about 1 John chapter 4, verse 11? This is the morning for phone calls. We'll take them in a minute. All right, 1 John chapter 4, verse 11. I love this. We're going. Dear friends, since God has so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Man, I love this. He says, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Since God loved us, we are to turn love toward one another. So this becomes so interesting because God has loved us, we should love others. The evidence that we have received God's love is in us loving those around us. This becomes so important. 1 John chapter 4, verse 12, he says, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and love is made complete in us. Now, what I find so interesting about this is, why does he say no one has ever seen God? He's not talking about seeing God, he's talking about love. Because this is it. When we take the love that God has given us and we pour it out on somebody else, God is seen through that. The unseen God becomes seen when we act out his love for those around us. How this world would be different, how these people around us would be so different if we moved into that even more. God himself puts him on display through our actions. That is powerful. That becomes life-changing. The unseen God becomes seen in us. This is the greatest evidence of God working in our life. We can talk about a lot of different evidences of God working in our life. There could be power, there could be popularity, there could be passionate feelings. But the greatest is love. When people see love in us, that's the greatest evidence that God is working and moving in our life. Number 5, use your gifts to serve. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Here we go, guys. Life can easily turn into a vicious cycle, and we all feel it from time to time. It's eat, work, and sleep. Eat, work, and sleep. Eat, work, and sleep. Day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. Year in, year out. We're getting ready to enter into 2025. How did that happen? I feel like we just started 2024. I remember when 1999 became 2000. Never could we get to 2025. It's too far away. And here we are. It's easy to get into this rut and go through this vicious cycle. There's 3 ways that we can live our life. We can either waste it, and there's lots of things we can waste it on. Our culture makes this a high priority of giving us all kinds of meaningless stuff that we can waste our life on. We can spend it on a career, we can spend it on a hobby and just kind of dive into that and just pour our life into that. Or we can invest it. And when we take the gifts that God has given and use them not just for ourselves but for others, for the church, for our community, for those around us, we are not wasting our life, we're not spending it, we are investing it. Jesus told a whole parable about this, that we're storing up treasure in heaven. We are investing it. The question is, are we investing our life? Are we using the gifts that God gave us? Are we using them to serve others. God has given us gifts. Not only has he saved us, but he's called us. And when he called us, he gifted us with gifts and talents and abilities, and he expects us to use them to serve others. Are we doing that? And maybe two questions to ask. Do you know the gifts that you have? Do you know the gifts that he's given you? And are you using those gifts to help others? Use your gifts to serve those around you. 5 simple steps. Living for God's will. We are in choice overload in our world. Not even sure what kind of toothpaste to buy. And yet, how do we make big life decisions in this choice overload? If we are moving towards Christ, if we are moving towards God, it makes it a lot easier for us to receive his will and then begin moving in that direction. Have we armed ourselves with his attitude, or we just have our carnal thinking, normal thinking going on in our head and leave it to that? Have we left our past behind us? Are we different than the way we were before? Are we watching and praying? Or have we just kind of been lulled to sleep in our prayer life? Are we loving above all? And are we using our gifts to serve? Which one of these do you need to work on? Which one of these, as I've been talking, you feel like, yeah, God's telling me this is the one I need to work on? Do we want God's direction and guidance for our life? Then we need to do this. Don't know what to do in the midst of persecution, crisis, difficulties? Do this. Want a great way to invest your life and make it matter, make it count? Do this. It's not beyond our ability. It might be beyond our current discipline, because this does take some discipline. But it's not beyond our ability. It's not beyond God's ability in our life. But we have to do it.